Hey look, there goes old man Bacon with his Zimmer frame, yelling at the kids to get off his lawn while fondly recounting his time in Korea. He wasn't in a war, or anything. He just had a vacation there once. It was lovely, thanks. It never ceases to amaze me how it was only a few years ago that I was part of the up-and-coming generation. We were the future, and nobody was younger than us. Fast forward a few years, and there's an entire generation below me now. Suddenly, I'm no longer the future. I'm the present. It's an existential nightmare that brings me to my knees every day. Slight exaggeration. But being in my mid-20s, it is a bit of fun to go back to some of my old favorite shows from when I was growing up to see how they hold up. Very rarely do they actually hold up, mostly because I was a bit of an idiot in my early days, so not much has changed. Slight exaggeration. But being an idiot in my early years, I wasn't exactly into intelligent television. With one exception, Dave the Barbarian. It was my favorite show back in the day, and was also the favorite cartoon of pretty much my entire family. It came out when I was 6 years old, and recently I've had the urge to go back and binge the whole series to see if my favorite childhood show actually still is any good. Surprisingly, it's one of the few shows that I've gone back to that not only holds up, it's actually better now than when I first watched it. It's genuinely one of the most intelligently written shows I've seen, in spite of being targeted at a younger audience. So I thought that it would be fun to look back on the series and do an episode-by-episode retrospective to see how each episode holds up, and in the end, see how well the series as a whole stacks up. So this is the Dave the Barbarian series retrospective. Working title. This video is going to be the intro to the retrospective, where I will establish everything you need to know about the series going forward. That way I won't have to repeat myself as much. So if you're already familiar with the series, then there's no need to watch this. You can skip straight to the first episode. Fair warning as well, I'm preemptively going to give this video and the series as a whole a rating of PG-13 for coarse language and adult themes. Why? Because I like to swear and make dirty jokes, and I don't plan on stopping even if I'm talking about a kid's show from years ago. So if there's any parents watching this with their kids, or any parents within earshot of my voice, this video series might not be appropriate for your kids. Don't say I didn't warn you. And if you do get mad at me for having these videos not be directly aimed at your kids, well, not everything has to be catered to your crotch goblins, Karen. This intro has been burned into my skull for years. I heard it hundreds of times, and even after not listening to it for many years, I can still sing along. This theme also doubles as the elevator pitch for the show. It takes place in a fictional land called Udragoth, which is a sort of medieval land with very contemporary elements like shopping malls or competitive sports arenas, for example. This is by no means a straight medieval setting either. It's fully fantasy, with gods and monsters, magic and sorcery, dragons and giants, and everything in between. It uses the various fantastical elements of the world to clash with the mundanities of the contemporary elements for deadly funny effect. Like when one character goes to the mall to shop for the latest fashion and gets offered a hat that's also a snake. It's a combination of non sequiturs that are emphasized by the absolutely ridiculous setting. The show stars the royal family, Dave, Fang, Candy, Uncle Oswich, and also Lula, but she is not part of the family. She can't be family. She's a sword. Dave, Fang, and Candy's parents took off on a globe-trotting adventure to destroy all the evils of the world, so the three of them, and more specifically Candy, have been left in charge of the kingdom. This set of characters is sort of a subversion of the typical family unit in media. You have a clear-headed, mature older brother in Dave, voiced by Danny Cooksey, who also happens to be a brick shithouse barbarian. In fact, he's the titular barbarian, which in this world is more of an occupation rather than any sort of group of savage people, which is the traditional definition of barbarian that we're all used to. The whole occupational element of being a barbarian is evident in the episode Rite of Pillage, where Dave has to take a bunch of tests in order to become a certified barbarian.
D-minus! David, today you are a barbarian!
It's evident that he doesn't really care to be a barbarian. In spite of being a giant, he prefers the finer things like art, literature, and even knitting. But he's always willing to step up if his family, or otherwise things he enjoys in life, are in danger, like that time he decided to save the day because his cupcakes were in danger.
My cupcakes! I cannot stand
idly by and let innocent fake goods come to harm.
What are you gonna do, Dave?
I'm going to coach!
And sometimes he'll just stumble into success through sheer dumb luck, like that time that he saved the day because he happened to have been making potatoes au gratin at the time. I know there's a lot to unpack in that sentence, but just trust me on that one. However, just as likely as he is to stumble into success, he's also just as likely to fall on his face in failure. Sometimes he'll end up running away screaming, or he'll put himself into a situation where he's in way over his head, which is where you might hear his famous catchphrase.
Bejabbers!
Now that's a 6-lane pileup of the vocal cords, I tell you what. That's the catchphrase that's indelibly linked to the series, so much so that if you happen to say bejabbers to someone of a certain age, there's a good chance that their eyes will light up. Finally, as the theme song says, he's an absolute wimp. Even though he's identified as a barbarian, most of the time he wouldn't harm a fly, so it plays into the mature pacifist older brother stereotype while also being a clear subversion, with him being a barbarian while also being a pacifist. So these aspects of his character make for some fun juxtaposition that creates a lot of comedic potential. I'd say Dave is probably the second most consistently funny character in the series, at least as far as characters that are featured in every episode. Faffy and Twinkle the horse that talks like Christopher Walken are more consistently funny characters, but don't quite have the same spotlight. Who's the funniest of the main cast though? Well, we'll get to that. Opposite to Dave, you have the little sister Fang, voiced by Tress MacNeille. She has the mind of a barbarian, but the body of a 9-year-old, so she's very ruthless, but also very ineffectual, which is often the crux of jokes at her expense. That's the central point of conflict with her character as well. She would be the perfect barbarian if she wasn't a tiny child, which is often a point of jealousy between her and Dave. She'll frequently be compared to a monkey, which will prompt her catchphrase.
I'm not a monkey!
It's maybe a bit overdone, but it's acceptable. In her spotlight episodes, she's usually the one who gets everyone into trouble for one reason or another. She also has her more tender episodes, such as the episode Fiends and Family, which showcases the effect of parental separation on a young child. She's the youngest and therefore least independent person in the family, so the parents being away to fight evil affects her the most. It's a surprisingly sweet episode. The series does have its share of emotional episodes, but thankfully they never go too overboard with the sappiness. Even in that aforementioned episode, which is the most sappy episode out of them all, at least as far as I can remember, is still hilarious. In fact, that episode probably contains my favorite joke in the entire series. Which I won't spoil, but rest assured, it's a good one. Fang as a character could have easily had a one-note personality, but they gave her enough to do that it's never repetitious. She's not quite as funny of a character as Dave, but she doesn't quite have the same spotlight, so she doesn't need to be. Even then, she still has great episodes and great moments. Then there's Candy, voiced by Erica Luttrell, whose entire character stems from the fact that she's a teenager who suddenly is the leader of an entire country, and instead of being a mature leader who rises to the occasion, naturally she abuses the hell out of her power in multiple cases. Her episodes tend to focus on the typical teenager things: materialism, superficiality, self-image, the works. It might sound preachy, but they make it work in various ways, especially in the main self-image episode, which subverts the usual trope of not being slim enough and instead involves Candy wanting to impress a guy who likes hulking women.
Doggy bladders! It's Bicepia, the warrior woman! The boys are going nuts over her!
She's maybe the weakest character out of the ensemble, but by this show's standards, it still means that she's hysterical. There are many jokes in particular that center around her wardrobe or interest in fashion, which is the source of much hilarity.
These are all my clothes. No, they're not. You got that whole warehouse full of, well, these are all my best clothes.
She's a typically vain, self-absorbed teenager, which can be grating, but they do give her appropriate comeuppance when the situation calls for it, and even then she has her fair share of tender moments to balance out the hysterical moments. So she's a well-rounded character that has a lot of solid writing behind her. In spite of the fact that she is the typical teenage girl stereotype, she's backed up by a lot of clever writing that makes it work. And speaking of hysterical characters, Lula the Sword. She's Dave's sword and is voiced by legendary voice actress Estelle Harris. I think that's how it's pronounced. I'm gonna look that up. Okay, so I pronounced it correctly, I just didn't put enough emphasis on the S. It's supposed to be Estelle, not Estelle. Anyways. Estelle Harris is probably the biggest voice actor on this show. If you're like me, you may know her from such roles as Muriel in The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody or Mrs. Potato Head in Toy Story, but she's been around forever. Lula is probably my favorite character in the show. She's an absolute deadpan, sassy, sarcastic bitch, and every word out of her mouth is solid gold.
Honey, remind me to get you another brain cell to keep the one you've got company.
She's always there to offer a witty remark or play off one of her many running jokes like how she's old or how she's dull. Her spotlight episodes are some of the best in the series. She is forgotten about at times, like in the episode The Terror of Mecha Dave when there's 2 of her, which is a shame, but when she's there, man, she is fantastic. Plus, a sentient sarcastic sword, that's about as non sequitur as it gets. So whomever came up with that character, they're not being paid enough. Then you have the parental figure of the quintet, Uncle Oswidge, voiced by Kevin Michael Richardson. His whole thing is that he tries to fix things with magic because he's a wizard, or a sorcerer, or whatever they're calling the magic dewy person at this particular moment. But he's also a terrible wizard or sorcerer or whatever, so constantly screws up. He has the fewest spotlight episodes from what I can remember, but the ones that he has are great, with one in particular which is oddly touching, and his involvement in the ensemble episodes is always good for a few laughs. There's not as much to his character as the other members of the crew. He's more or less the parental figure, but they really make it work as they do with all the other characters in their roles. What's so genius about this family unit is that each character represents an archetype in the standard television family unit, but they're able to subvert those archetypes so brilliantly. You have the mature older brother that kind of holds the family together, but he's also a barbarian. Then you have the wild, crazy little sister who's always getting herself into trouble, but she goes so far in that direction that she's basically a primate. Then you have the ditzy older sister with a princess complex who's literally a princess. Lula's the sarcastic family friend who's always giving grief to the family, but they keep her around because they know she means well. Finally, you have the bumbling elder, placed as the butt of pretty much every joke imaginable, whose entire gimmick revolves around screwing up magic in this case, which takes that archetype to the extreme. It's like all of the modern family archetypes put through the filter of a crazy fantasy story, which once again creates an incredibly funny juxtaposition when you have all of these modern sensibilities mixed with all of these medieval fantastical elements. Juxtaposition is what this show does amazingly. The main villain is named the Dark Lord Chuckles the Silly Piggy, for Christ's sake, voiced by Paul Rugg, by the way. The incongruity between the Dark Lord and then Chuckles the Silly Piggy is absolutely genius. Just his name cracks me up. He's paradoxically an evil pig that's also considered really cute, but then he gets really sensitive about that. He has a terminal Napoleon complex, a serious ego, and is an eccentric weirdo whose entire role on the show is to think of the most ridiculous plans possible. His weapon of choice is the Mystic Amulet of Hog Swinemore, which he introduces every time he uses it in a characteristically over-the-top manner.
But I still have the Mystic Amulet of Hog Swinemore!
Now, there are many other villains who get used throughout the series to varying effect, like Neil Frischman, Man of Tomorrow, who comes from the distant high-tech year of 1994. And the older this show gets, the funnier that joke will be. Crazy to think that 1994 was only 9 years before the premiere of the first episode. Now, there are plenty of villains to make sure that Chuckles as the main villain doesn't get too tiresome, which is good because he is in danger of becoming tiresome at times from overuse. I'll cover the less reoccurring villains as we go. This entire cast is tied up in a neat little bow by another character who remains unseen and whose inclusion is absolute genius from a storytelling perspective: the narrator. Narrators have obviously been done before, but I don't think I've ever seen it done this cleverly. Now, the episode runtime in this show is 11 minutes, so they need to have a breakneck pace to keep the story going and be able to pay off everything properly without it seeming half-baked. So they use the narrator to bridge the gap in the story when needed, while also adding his own brand of humor to these scenes.
Will Faffy be able to communicate with the terrible dragons? And most importantly to Faffy, will they like him? What will they be like? Will they be his friends? Will they poke him and call him Jasper? All this runs through Faffy's mind. Or it would if his brain weren't the size of a blueberry.
So they're able to keep a fast pace because the narrator makes it so they don't need to fill in the extra space with extra exposition, meaning this show is just stuffed to the gills with content and there's almost no dead space. Everything's there that needs to be there, and the writing is stellar, making for a deadly combination that makes this show dynamite. Even when the jokes fall flat, the pace is so quick that it makes the jokes that don't work because it zooms by so quickly that you don't really have time to think about it. Most of the time anyway. Hell, the narrator becomes an active character in the show at times, even receiving his own spotlight episode, which is one of the highlights of the entire series. The narrator is voiced by Jeff Bennett, who's a fairly big-time voice actor. Chances are you've heard his voice somewhere. For example, I know him as the voice of Cyril from the Legend of Spyro trilogy of all things, where he honestly does the exact same voice as he does with the narrator in this show.
Spyro, this way quickly! Or ignore me
He has a very rich and appealing voice that also plays into the humor of his character. You don't expect this voice to get flustered and be making sarcastic quips. It's like if Rod Serling did stand-up. It does become a bit formulaic with his narration starting every episode, but they really don't have time to waste, and so there's no other way to establish what's going on in such a way as to not waste too much time. Now, of course, beyond the main cast, you have a host of reoccurring side characters like the aforementioned Faffy. He's the family pet, a dragon that shoots lightning, and is often described as a flying potato.
Is it a gigantic vicious beast?
Hey, it's more of a dumb little flying potato or something.
He's sort of the Ralph Wiggum of this universe, a dim-witted character specifically brought out to do something stupid or be the butt of the joke, and he's hilarious. He's definitely a character that wasn't brought out much, maybe a few times an episode at best, but that's good because it means that they never overuse him to the point of having the shtick grow old. So you know whenever you see him, 9 times out of 10, it makes for a good moment. Plus, his main Spotlight episode is probably my favorite episode in the entire series. How about the aforementioned Twinkle the Marvel Horse? He's even more scarcely used, but is a hoot. He's nihilistic, he's depressed, he's melodramatic, all spoken in a comedy Christopher Walken voice.
I had that dream again. The one where I do terrible things to penguins with a croquet mallet.
Oh, we definitely gotta get you out of that stable more.
He's solid gold, and the juxtaposition of having that voice come out of something that wouldn't look out of place on My Little Pony, it's hysterical. Another fun side character is the shopkeeper, Mrs. Bogmelon, whose thing is that she's disgusting, which makes me wonder how she's a Mrs. Seriously, that means somebody married that. But she's also a con artist, doing everything in her power to try and make a quick buck, selling inferior products, price gouging at a moment's notice, and also this little gem.
Get your proud to be a worthless loser t-shirts. Today only one for the price of 2.
She's the most side of all the side characters, except for maybe the town crier or Candy's boring friends. In their case, I honestly struggle to remember one thing they ever did that was even slightly memorable. And honestly, I couldn't even remember their names off the top of my head, which for the record are Dinky and Cheezette. But those characters, or any other minor characters, barely count as characters, as none of them really get any sort of spotlight episode, or even great involvement in any of the episode plots, other than the odd line here or there to move the plot along. The family's parents, King Throcktar and Queen Glimea, might be considered side characters as well, but they don't really do much aside from calling in every now and again to let the family know what's going on and maybe kickstart the plot if needed, like in the cases where they send the family something that ends up being the plot of the episode. Otherwise, they're barely used, and when they are used, rarely for more than a moment. They're more running jokes than characters, but they serve their purposes well enough. It's a shame we don't get any sort of spotlight episode on them to help flesh them out, but it is what it is. Speaking of running jokes, however, as far as the running jokes go in this series, there are plenty. I've already mentioned some, but pretty well every character can be relied upon for some repeated joke. We can rely on Faffy to murder Dave every now and again. We can rely on Dave having a deadly allergic reaction at some point.
It could be worse.
How?
Dave could be allergic to coal.
He is.
Oh, yeah.
Which I'm wondering if that would fly today, given how sensitive people can be over things like this. I don't care. I think it's funny. Uncle Oswidge probably has the most running jokes. Aside from being bad at magic, he's bald, fat, and addicted to what's called nutlogs, some sort of candy in this world, all of which makes for hilarity at some point in the series. And there's also the matter of pretty well every episode having some sort of running joke. Sometimes these running jokes play into the larger plot, at times even ending up being the Deus Ex Machina, but sometimes they're just there to fill the jokes quota, like that time that Lula kept alerting Dave to nose nuggets. Her words, not mine. The episode's specific running jokes are a bit of a mixed bag, but they hit more often than not. The animation in this series is okay. It's kind of a standard mid-2000s digitally animated show as far as animation quality goes, but they make it work for the style of writing. The writing is very snappy, so they have a quick and exaggerated style of movement and animation to complement it. They keep it simple so that they can do these big bombastic animations, which might mean this show doesn't look quite as good as it could, but it looks as good as it needs to, and it has creative imagery and animation out the wazoo. In all, there's 41 episodes, all of which takes up 11 minutes of the 22-minute runtime, minus one 2-part episode which takes up the whole 22 minutes. It might seem churlish to analyze what is blatantly a show aimed at kids, but as a wise man once said, if something aimed at kids can only be enjoyed by kids, then it's bad children's media. The major goal of any piece of media is to transcend age, because that shows skill in writing if something can be equally enjoyed by all, and it makes for the most profit, because in doing so you have a lifelong viewer. And I have anecdotal evidence that this show has just that transcendent quality, as my dad was even a fan of the show. It was his favorite cartoon for a while. So it has the potential to be transcendent, assuming it holds up, and that is exactly what I'm going to be looking at with this series of videos. Now, I'm not sure how careful to be when using footage of this show. The video archives of this show have been up for a very long time, and this show isn't on Disney+, so I don't think Disney really cares, but I could be wrong, and even if they don't, that could change on a dime. So I'll try using the footage freely as much as I feel, but I wouldn't be shocked if I have to re-upload these videos with reduced footage usage. But with that out of the way, that concludes the series overview. We've covered the premise, the setting, the characters, the episode structure, the animation, and now we just need to talk about each individual episode, one at a time. God help me, what have I gotten myself into? So next time, we're going to be taking a look at episode 1, which is also episode 13, it'll make more sense when I cover it, and that episode is The Way of the Dave. Hopefully this video should have provided the answers to any questions that may come up about the series from an overarching point of view, so if anyone has any questions, I will refer them to this video, so be sure to like this video and subscribe for more. We're in for the long haul, folks, so strap in.